Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating how you can transform a GraphQL query into a REST endpoint. So let's get started. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to be making use of the Trevor Blades country's GraphQL endpoint. And here's the query that I'm going to be transforming into a REST endpoint. I'm going to be requesting some information about countries. So I'm going to show you how that's going to work. I want the name of the country. I am interested in the capital of the country. I'm interested in the currency. I think for now that should be enough. And if I were to query this, this is the information that I'm going to be getting at the moment. I've got the name, I've got the capital and the currency. This is a list of all countries that exist in the world at the moment that have been queried by the Trevor Blades API. So this is the query that we're going to be transforming into a REST endpoint so that when we call that REST endpoint, we are going to be receiving exactly this information. So in order to transform this query into a REST endpoint, we're going to be heading back on to Tyke. So here's the Tyke dashboard. Now let's head on over under System Management to the APIs section. Here I'm going to be adding a new endpoint. I'm going to call it REST countries. And I'm going to leave everything else the same. Let's keep the target URL as it is. It's not going to matter eventually, but let's keep it as it is. Hit configure. The other change that I'm going to be making is that I'm just going to open up the authentication mode and change it to keyless just for the purpose of this demonstration. So with that, our endpoint has now been created and we can test that out really quickly by just copying this API URL right at the top here. Heading over to Postman, we're going to be using this to send our request and receive our responses. Post it here. And I get some information back. This is from HTTP bin. It's giving me some basic information out here. So this is the original REST endpoint that we have just created. Now, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be transforming this along the way and converting this endpoint to query that specific country's information that we just saw from Trevor Blades. So let's head back. Now up here in the third tab, you will find that we've got the endpoint designer. So let's go over to the endpoint designer. And we are going to be using the virtual endpoint. Virtual endpoints are unique to Tyke. With a virtual endpoint, you can plug short JavaScript functions at the end of a Tyke root, or Tyke endpoint, and have them run when the endpoint is called. So we'll see that in action shortly. So I'm going to add a new endpoint and I'm going to select the virtual endpoint under plugins. So it tells me function. I'm just going to call it myTransformerFunction. Copy that. I need to select the source. I'm going to be selecting inline because we're going to be making and editing things right here from the code editor. I'm going to change the name of the function to match mine. And I'm going to hit update. So with that, I can head on over to Postman. And if I were to hit send on that request, I'll see that this is a virtual endpoint. So it's essentially hijacked that endpoint now. And instead of going over to HTTP bin, it is now calling that virtual endpoint, our JavaScript function that we have just written. So now let's change that so that this endpoint is, or this virtual endpoint is now going to be querying our country's endpoint from Trevor Blades. Okay. There are a couple of steps to do this. Let's start off by writing our transformationLogic function. So let's call it function. Call it transformationLogic. This is going to take in the request as a parameter. And inside here, we're going to be starting off by constructing our request object. Okay, so what do we need here? We need a few things. We're going to be starting off with the method. It's going to be post. We need the domain. It's going to be the URL endpoint of the Trevor Blades API. We are going to be needing headers. Specifically, we want to send our content as JSON. So we're going to be setting up content type to be application JSON. And then finally, we need to send in our query in the form of a body. So that I'm going to open up an object, put in query. And here I'm going to be adding in countries, name, capital, and currency, just like we had done previously. I'm going to close my brackets appropriately. Okay, that is our request object. Now, a couple more things before the request object is ready. Request objects typically can only have strings in them. So we have a few objects here, so we need to convert each of them. So let's start off with the body. I'm going to convert that using JSON.stringify, common JavaScript method for those familiar. And we need to do the same with our entire request object as well. Brackets. Okay, so now our request object is ready to be sent. So let's do that. We're going to be sending in a request. We're going to put that inside a response object. And we're going to be using a Tyke function called TykMakeHttpRequest. And we're going to be sending in our request object in there. And finally, we're going to be returning our response, but in the form, the response we're going to be that we will receive is going to be in the form of a string. So we're going to be using JSON.parse to return that in the form of an object. Okay, I think all things fine. I think that's the function that we need. Now heading back to the original function, which is the myTransformerFunction, we need to add in a couple of lines here. Starting off with a response, which is going to be calling the transformationLogic and sending in the request. And finally, we need to set the body of the original response object to body of the response that we just received. And then we're going to be returning the TykJsResponse back to the endpoint as the primary response that goes through. So now if everything is fine, everything has been taken care of appropriately, and we hit update and we head back into Postman, we have our query. So we have our query, specifically the country's information, the name, the capital, and the currency of each of the countries under there. Now, of course, this looks this way because it is coming back in the form of text. If you want to change that into JSON as well, a simple way to do that is just to use another plugin. So if we head back, and this is a bit of a bonus here, if we head back into our endpoint designer, I can add an endpoint and add a new plugin called modify headers. And in here, I'm going to go into the response header, add content type, application, JSON, and hit add. So now if I hit update and head back over and make the same request, I will receive the information in the form of JSON. And it's a lot easier to read that. So that's it. We have taken a GraphQL query, which is querying information about countries, and we've transformed that into a REST endpoint. Hope you found this useful. See you next time.